Okay, we're working. Hi there, I think we're now live. So welcome to our Google Hangout. We think everything's okay. Kasia, yes, Kasia's we're linked, we're hooked, great. Welcome to the first Google Hangout for our online course, The Right to Education. For us here in Scotland, it's the afternoon, so good afternoon. For others of you, it might be night time. For others of you, the morning, or perhaps you're catching up by watching it on YouTube. But whatever time of day, welcome to our Google Hangout. And we're really pleased that you're able to join us. I'm Margaret Sutherland. You've seen some videos already of me. And with me in the room, we have Kasia.
Hi.
And also Badria, who's here. And they are going to be here with us throughout this session. And Kasia and Badria are going to be monitoring any questions that come in while we are on air, and they'll pass those over to me, and we'll do our best to talk about the issues that you've raised. So if you haven't managed to send a question, we ask that you do that by last night, and many of you did, and thank you. If you haven't done that yet, don't worry, we still have time. Just fire in your question and we'll pick it up. So, although we're only 3 days into our online course, I think already there's lots of interesting comments from people. We've been really excited to either last thing at night or first thing in the morning see how many more people have joined us, how many more people have introduced themselves, where you're from. We've got a fabulous range of countries all across the world. Kasia and Badria have been having a look and taking a note of all the different countries represented and all the different jobs that people do, different names, different titles, parents, people just interested in education and young people and learning. And I think for us probably that's one of the highlights of being involved in a course like this, and we hope that being able to interact with people from all over the world talking about issues that we all care about is as a highlight for you too. So we're very aware that the countries that are represented are all different. Unseasonably, we're having a very, very hot spell just now in Scotland. It's been beautiful sunny weather for about a week and a half, and we're really excited about this because, well, that's not always what the weather's like here, but it's been absolutely super. But we know that for some of you, that's the weather you have all the time, and in actual fact, a little bit of rain and a little bit cooler weather would be really good. So there's lots of differences about the countries that we represent, weather, food, climate, all sorts of things. Culture is very different too. We've got many people from many different cultures. We've got lots of different education systems represented. But I think the really interesting thing is we're all still grappling with the same issues. How do you support learners? How do you include all? What is education all about? What about formal education, informal, non-formal education? And what about qualifications? Somebody asked an important question about the difference between vocational education and academic type education. And one of the things that always strikes me when you talk to teachers and you work with teachers and when you read research papers, journal articles and so on is that it seems to me that the greater advances that we've made in medicine, and we've made huge advances in medicine and in technology, and the more that these advances have taught us about learning and about teaching and the very kind of individualistic nature of learning and teaching, almost kind of at the same time, we've tried to standardize things. And that seems to me a real tension. And I think some of the questions that we'll pick up on today and some of the comments that some of you have made under some of the sections and activities on our online course are indeed picking up on that tension. I think the other issue that I have is with the idea perhaps of standardization is that it's also kind of driving us down the kind of what works or what's the best practice route, with the kind of notion that, well, if we can find out what works, then we just need to do that and everything will be okay. And I think one of the things we'll do in week 3 is to explore the idea of contextualized pedagogy. So what does it mean to take ideas of learning and teaching, of pedagogy, how we do learning and teaching, what we know about learning and teaching, and how do we bring it into our systems, bring it into our country, into our cultures in a way that is right and sensitive and appropriate for where we are. I've spent many years in schools in Scotland. I'm either in schools as a teacher or working in my role now within the university. And the more time I spend in schools, the more you begin to realise how different they all are. They can be distance-wise separated by very short distance, and yet they're very different. So we need to, I think, contextualise pedagogy, and that's what worries me a little bit about the what works, or let's find best practice sort of situation that we sometimes find ourselves in. But as I say, we're going to explore some of that in week 2 and in week 3, and perhaps that kind of opening thoughts there, perhaps these opening thoughts lead us to one of the questions that was posted last night by Ruth. And Ruth's question is, how can schools balance a desire to be inclusive of all pupils with the need to demonstrate academic progress to senior leaders, inspectors, etc.? The "every pupil benefits from teaching alongside pupils with additional needs" line is not as accepted as it used to be. So there's a question and then a kind of a statement there, and we've tried to pick up on that. I suppose one thing we also want to say at the beginning of this first Google Hangout is that myself and Kasia and Badri are not sitting here in Scotland in the University of Glasgow thinking, oh, we'll let you know, ask us your questions, we've got all the answers. We don't have all the answers. In fact, I don't think anybody anywhere has all the answers. But I do think we have some answers, and I do think we have some experience, and I do think we have some ideas that when we all share these, we can all become better informed. So we've got lots of questions, and we're going to discuss those questions, but we're not necessarily going to always give a nice, easy, straightforward, here's the answer, now you go and do this, because we just don't actually believe that works for learners. So back to the question then, how can schools balance the desire to be inclusive of all pupils with the need to demonstrate academic progress to senior leadership, inspectors and so on? Well, as I was thinking, and as we were thinking about that question, we kind of thought, well, I suppose it really depends on how you're going to measure academic progress. And what do we mean by academic progress? And what do governments and leaders and inspectors mean by academic progress? And also, what do governments and leaders and inspectors and so on count and value as academic progress? We will often measure what we value. And so if academic progress is measured in a particular way, so for example, X number of passes for a particular kind of exam. So in Scotland, it would be, well, if you leave school with X number of hires, that's one of our national exams, then that would suggest that you've made progress and you're reaching certain standards. And your country, I'm sure, has a similar. In England, it would be GCSEs and A levels. Well, if that's how we're going to measure academic progress, then some pupils may not be considered to be making academic progress because they don't reach that measure. And I guess for some children, for some young people, academic progress may be that a child with no verbal communication and a child who doesn't communicate with you, this morning when you met them, smiled at you. This may in fact be progress for that child. Whether you then decide whether that's academic progress or not is up for debate. But if we're talking about learning and children's learning and children progressing, then I think we need to also look wider than just academic progress. I think we need to look at holistic progress of a child, how they're developing across subject areas and as individuals as well. So I guess an answer to the question about how do you demonstrate academic progress, then perhaps having evidence of progress that children have made and young people have made as a way of starting discussions. So if you are talking to the management in your school, for example, having examples of work that can demonstrate the progress a child has made. They were here, we did this, and they're now here. May be a kind of starting point for discussions with them about progress. I thought your comment about every pupil benefiting from teaching alongside other pupils with additional support needs isn't accepted, or it doesn't seem to be accepted as it used to be, I think is the phrase you use. Well, I think there's often an assumption made that children and young people who require additional support for learning require something that is vastly different from other pupils. And I'm not sure that I necessarily think that's the case. And certainly I think, and we'll look much more at this in week 3, but if we look at some of the strategies that you will employ, and interestingly, we're going to talk later, but somebody asked about strategies. Not quite sure how to pronounce your name, so do forgive me if I don't say it correctly, but is it Nair? Asked about methods that are used for working with pupils who have dyslexia, and I'll pick up on that later. But if you look at that, for example, then many of the strategies that you use for children with one label actually are useful for everybody, whether a child has a label or no label at all, is simply a learner. So in my experience, then I would say that while the line may not be accepted, I would say that the evidence would suggest that sometimes what you do with one particular group is indeed good for all. Do we have any questions coming in online yet? No, that's okay. We've got plenty here that we can still talk about. Another question that was interesting, and the discussion indeed on the activities was interesting. Cherry Ann has asked about promoting rights of children in your classroom. And if you've reached the bit in this week's activities where we're talking about the United Nations Convention, then there's some really interesting discussions under that activity. And if you scroll down, you'll notice one of the comments was made by a Scottish teacher called Fiona Stewart. Incidentally, Fiona was an ex-pupil of mine, so I'm absolutely delighted to have got in touch with Fiona again. I also taught her brothers as well, and it's great to know that Fiona is herself a teacher and now is very interested in how you support learners. But Fiona talks about creating a rights-respecting school, and this is something that many schools in Scotland are trying to become and are endeavouring to engender this notion of their school being a rights-respecting school. And there's certainly materials that you can find online about that. From just doing a Google search, you can find materials for that. But I think, and I this morning I actually put in a comment about this, I think one of the things that has to go alongside rights is the idea of responsibilities. And I think that by everybody in school, so teaching staff, janitorial staff, if you have dinner ladies who are there, secretarial staff, admin support staff, everybody has to be engaged in the notion of being a rights-respecting school, respecting others, considering others. Kasha's just sneezed, bless you, Kasha. A rights-respecting school would be one where that is just part and parcel of how we are in this school, how we behave towards each other, that we respect the differences that we all bring to the school and to the classroom. But with that, as I say, I think comes responsibility. I did say in my comment this morning online was that I remember in the early 1990s, so Britain signed the UN Convention and we ratified that in 1991. And very much in the early 90s in schools we were talking a lot about rights and we were sharing with young people. We had an Education Act in 1995, the Children Act, and very much it was about involving children in their learning. Children had a right to be present at meetings where they were being discussed and had a right to input into curriculum and so on. And many of us in the 1990s were very much trying to help and learn with young people what it meant to have rights. But I do remember young people in schools turning around and kind of using this and saying, well, you can't ask me to do that. I know my rights. or indeed refusing to do things because I know my rights. And so I think it's not as simple as telling people they have rights. I think we need to explore what that means, and also that we all have rights, and teachers have rights too. So rights, right promoting school is great, and I think in many places, and you can see that from the comments, I think too many countries endeavouring to look at this and to think what this means, but with rights perhaps comes responsibility. So that was Cherry Ann's question. Thank you for that question. The next question we had was from Louisa and Susan, and they, I guess, have almost picked up on the idea of education being more than just school. And they are questions, they asked different questions, but the common theme in the two questions was about involving families and parents, particularly perhaps when parents and families are dealing with their own issues such as drug and alcohol abuse, or indeed where they've had bad experiences of education. And I think the question they were both asking was essentially about how do you engage disengaged parents, I suppose. And I think your education's interesting. Everybody's got a view in education because most people, a lot of the population in any country have been to school. And so therefore they know how school works. And they remember how school was in their day. And they remember the experiences that they had in school. And although we perhaps don't realise that, I think we are influenced hugely by what experiences we had ourselves when we were at school. And that very much colours our views on schools, I think. And it did always strike me, I used to be at one point a behaviour support teacher. So I used to work with children who, by and large, although not all of them, came from chaotic lifestyles at home, came from very troubled families, came from the kind of family that Louisa was talking about, where the parents were addicted to some substance or another, and where, in actual fact, the parents were struggling to kind of get themselves together, and therefore it became very difficult for them to then to look after and to care for their children in ways that were kind of the expected norm that they would be doing. And in many ways, I could really understand and felt for these parents who were struggling with their own issues. But the other thing that used to occur to me was that where their children were really struggling at school and where they were becoming an issue over behaviour, being defiant or kicking off in some way or another, that was when the schools often wanted to contact the parent and get the parent to come to the school to talk to them. And it used to always occur to me that we very, very seldom contacted the school when the children were doing well and said, come up and talk to us. Your child is doing so well, come and let's talk about this. So there was this kind of fear, I think, and I think parents, when I spoke to them, did talk about living in fear of their phone ringing and seeing it was the school. And they just didn't answer it. And I think certainly in our country here in Scotland, we have meetings where parents are invited to come, where they come into a meeting where there's a whole room full of professionals talking about their child. And sometimes these parents just didn't turn up. But that's a very daunting meeting for a parent to come into. And so I think we need to think very carefully about how and where and when we engage with parents. I don't think there's a quick fit kind of approach to this. But one of the things that I do think is really crucial and vital is the relationship that schools and staff within schools build up with parents. It won't be easy, necessarily. It won't be quick. It does take a long time because essentially what we're doing is building up a relationship of trust. And in many ways, all parents put great trust in us if you're a teacher. You know, they certainly in this country, they drop their child off at usually 9 o'clock in the morning, and then they collect them again at 3:30. And yes, we're very much trying to involve parents in education, in our schools, both in school physically, and then once the child goes home, we're trying to develop that very much. But there is a kind of sense of trust. You know, you leave your children with us, and that's, your child's a precious thing. So I think we need to build up trust with all parents, but I think that can take a long time. And it does, I think, involve us breaking down barriers that parents have perhaps built up, and instead we need to build up that kind of relationship. I think parents feeling nervous coming to school is not just an issue when your child is having trouble or in trouble, and having problems. And in actual fact, I know, talking to teachers, they say how nervous they get going into school to talk to the teachers about their child. So I think the minute you have that emotional attachment and involvement, which a parent has with their child, it changes things. I think also when we're working with parents, we need to think carefully about what the assumptions that we sometimes make. Because parents have been to school, and because we think, well, they do know something about school, we make certain assumptions that they know how schools work. And all schools work differently. And I think we have to remember that, and to help parents to get a picture of how school works. And I suppose this was brought home to me in an example, not actually to do with schools, but to do with another system, because it's something about systems, I think. So for example, I've been a teacher now, or involved in education, aspects of education in Scotland for 35 years. And I kind of know how a school system works. I know the changes we've been through. I know where we're at, and I know what I can see changes that are coming. I know kind of what those are, and I know what I think might happen, and how they might be implemented and change things again. But I understand the system because I'm an essentially I'm part of the system. But 4 years ago, my father had a stroke. I got a phone call late one Friday night from my mother saying, "Your dad's not well. I phoned an ambulance. I think it might be a stroke." And indeed it was, and it was a fairly severe stroke. He lost movement down his right-hand side. He lost his speech. He was in hospital for 5 months and went from there into a care home. But to come back to that Friday night, on the Saturday in the afternoon, we had phoned the hospital. We knew which hospital he'd been taken to. And so we phoned the hospital, and they said, yep, visiting time starts at 2 o'clock. And I can remember vividly, as we walked into the hospital, there was myself and my husband and my mother. And as we walked in, I remember thinking, this is really interesting. I've fortunately been very, very healthy, as have my father and mother and my husband. We didn't really have much dealings with hospitals or with our National Health Service, for which we're hugely grateful. Grateful for the National Health Service and for the fact we hadn't had much dealing with them. But as we walked in the door, I remember thinking, if this was a school, I know who I'd want to see, I know what I want to ask, and I know what is reasonable to ask. I think this is a hospital. I don't know how this works. And that was a very disempowering feeling for me as the healthy person coming in to ask and to find out about the situation with my father. A few nights later, I visited, and I remember saying to one of the nurses, and this nursing staff, the doctors, they were wonderful, absolutely wonderful. But I remember saying to the nurse, "Is there anything I need to know?" And with a lovely smile, she said to me, "Well, what would you like to know?" And I thought, well, I don't know, because I don't know what I don't know. And I said that to her, and she kind of just looked a little puzzled. It wasn't that they weren't willing to share information with me. They would have shared anything I had asked. I didn't know what to ask. And I've reflected a lot on my experience in hospital, and I rather think that experience that I had in that other system is a very similar experience to many parents who come to school to talk about their young person, their child. And so I think if we can, if we think about that as we're wanting to work with parents. I think that will help us. I think also we need to work in collaboration with other organisations. I think all of this discussion we're going to have about education being a right to education, education for all, inclusive education, inclusion, all of these things. Education is one part of this whole process, I think. And so I think we need to work together with, if your country has social services that are able to be involved, with non-governmental organisations, NGOs that are supporting the whole family. So it's not, the education bit is our bit, but we need to take our bit and work alongside with others. I think that's my thoughts about parents. Susan particularly asked about participation of volunteer groups in support of English language learners. And I was thinking about that, and it does strike me actually that in our universities, we have a great opportunity for our student population to be engaged in supporting and in volunteer roles. In fact, yesterday I was talking to a member of staff in my own university here about students volunteering, and it does strike me that there's probably lots of ways that we can link up organisations in order to support young people and adults for that matter too, just to kind of get engaged and be supporting. So I think that's my thoughts on those two questions regarding parents. Parents, crucial and vital, not least of all because they kind of give us, pop the children out in the first place and then into our care later as they come into formal education. Are we still doing okay? Okay. One of the interesting things I think about our online course is finding out where everybody comes from and what everyone does, and the range of titles that are used to describe what people do. Sometimes you're doing the same kind of job, but they're called something different. That even happens across, we have 32 education authorities in Scotland, and often titles differ between those 32 authorities in one country. So in our online course here, where there are many, many countries represented, there's a whole raft of titles. And I was really intrigued by Nair's statement where she said, I'm a social pedagogue. Now I've had the privilege of working with people from different parts of Europe, and certainly they talk a lot about pedagogues. And so anyway, one of the questions I said was, what do you do? Tell me more. So the question that has been asked is, what methods for working with pupils who are dyslexic, what can we do for pupils who are dyslexic? Interestingly, I was speaking this morning in Edinburgh, our capital city here in Scotland, with disability officers from across universities in Scotland. They'd all gathered at a seminar, and I was asked to talk about inclusion. And I put up a list of labels, essentially, of syndromes and some medically driven labels, and we were talking about which of these do you see in your students, which ones do you see most commonly, and the two most common issues that disability officers in universities were dealing with in terms of students, where one was dyslexia and the other one was around mental mental health issues. So I thought it was interesting that you were asking about dyslexia. There are lots and lots of strategies that can be used with people who are dyslexic. And again, access to the internet, you will find lots of websites and advice around dyslexia. As with anything you find on the internet, read it with caution, look and see who is posting it, where the advice is coming from, who's posting it, etc. But nonetheless, lots and lots of sources of information there. Also on the way back from Edinburgh, I was listening to a radio programme that was a kind of question and answer thing, and the person didn't answer the question. And I thought, oh, I must remember and try and answer the question. However, Nair, can you stay with us until week 3? Because if you hang in here till week 3, we actually look at the classroom and at strategies in much more depth. So I'm going to not kind of elaborate on the fact that there's lots you can do, other than to say that there are lots of things you can do, that there's lots of websites and resources and things that you can access, and we'll maybe pick up again on that. In fact, I'll get Badria and Kasha to remind me to pick up again on that question when we get to the Google Hangout in week 3. Again, we've got a question that's coming from Michael. Michael's asking, for young male gypsy travellers to reach a level of education to enable them to successfully apply for modern apprenticeships is virtually impossible. I'm not sure, I'm going to guess maybe, Michael, you're talking in a UK context. How can we start to resolve this issue? Whew, okay. Well, I did warn you at the beginning, I might have no easy answers to things. So, young male gypsy travellers reaching a level of education to enable them to successfully apply for modern apprenticeships. I certainly think in Scotland, and we are certainly very aware of the gypsy traveller community, and indeed there's a group based in Edinburgh, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, STEP, S-T-E-P, who are very concerned and work with and alongside the gypsy traveller communities. I guess here, well done, Kasha, the Scottish Traveller Education Programme, there you go, the Scottish Traveller Education Programme. It's based in Scotland, but in actual fact, if you have a look at their website, I think you'll find lots of quite useful information that might be of use to you there. However, I suppose one of the issues for the gypsy traveller community is often interrupted learning. So they're in school for a bit of time and then they go and then they come back, and there's that idea of how do you kind of bridge that gap. Although you're talking about this issue in relation to the gypsy traveller community, I think that whole idea of interrupted learning, there's an issue there, I think, too, in, for example, developing countries where young people are doing very well at school, no problems, and then they perhaps get some illness, for example, diabetes or trypanosomiasis, sleeping sickness. They drop out of school. They then get appropriate medical help. They get better. They get the condition under control. They come back to school and they've missed this chunk of education and nothing is done to kind of help them to catch up, and then they drop out again. So I think there's something about looking at how we can support them. I guess actually also support them when they're not in school or not in formal education. There is also an issue over as well what the community values. I certainly remember talking to teachers who worked with children from the gypsy traveller community and then saying to me that very much the argument at that point from the community was, well, as long as they go to school in primary, they learn as much as they need to know to be able to function well in our community. So there's perhaps something there about helping young people to think about where they want to go, about destinations, positive destinations after they leave the system, and how we can help them to get there. I don't know that I, to be honest, Michael, have a nice, neat, trite answer for you, but I think there is something, again, about working with the community and talking to the community about appropriate ways to support their young people. And it's back to, I guess, about what people value as well. If you want to come back with any comments, please do. As I said, I don't think I have just a nice, easy, straightforward answer to that very good question. Okay, okay. Another question that we had that somebody posted last night was from Thu. Again, apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. But they asked how to develop, and this is a big one, okay, how to develop a good educational system in which every child participates. Well, if I had the recipe for that, I would have shared it, believe me. Yeah, that's a huge question. And essentially, I suppose it is kind of what we're trying to grapple with here over the next 3 weeks. And we'll look more at systems. We're looking this week very much at the legislation, and next week we move on to look at systems and structures, and indeed whether some of the systems are the barriers to including young people. So I think, as I've thought about this question, thought a lot about it since you asked it, I think maybe there are a number of factors that might be crucial for what we decide is a good education system. And this is not me suggesting, if you remember, if you've been listening since the beginning, it's not me suggesting there is the right way to do it, or a best way to do it, or a what works way to do it. So I guess all of what I'm about to say is couched in that idea of it being appropriate for the culture, the country, the context, and your history. I teach here on a Master's in Inclusive Education, and we're very privileged to have a good number of Scottish teachers on our course and a great number of international students from all different parts of the world who are all studying here in Glasgow, studying this idea of inclusive education, research, policy and practice. And there is, no one right way to do this, I think. We do need to think of our history. Scotland does what Scotland does because Scotland is where Scotland is, geographically and historically. Badria, who is sitting here beside me, is from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And the system that Badria has come from, and we'll go back to, is where it is because of its history. Kasia is from Poland. Poland is where it is because of its history. Border shift, I was in Warsaw. And Warsaw, when I did a bit of reading about the history, used to be in the middle of Poland. And it's now kind of in the northeast. Is that fair to say, Kasia? Ish?
I would say central Poland.
Well, central Poland. Well, anyway, it's not where it was before because the borders have changed, Scotland's part of an island. Our border has been our border. England-Scotland borders maybe shifted, but not for a long time. And I would argue that all of those things have played a big part in how our education system has developed. And Scotland has a different education system from England. We have a devolved education system from the Westminster government that comes under the auspices of our Scottish Parliament, since we've had the Scottish Parliament in 1999, but we've always had a separate education system. So, even Scotland's history is not the same as England's history. So our current practice is very much rooted in where we've been. Now, where we've been explains where we are, but it doesn't need to necessarily shape where we might go. But I think we need to bear all of that in mind when we are thinking about systems. So anyway, other things that I think are important, perhaps, whatever system and whatever your history. Already, people have been talking about teachers and the role of the teacher. And a couple of times I found myself saying, we talk about teacher education. Stay with us. We'll get to that. We'll talk about teacher education. And I think we need well-educated teachers. And by that, I mean teachers who have a sound pedagogical knowledge, who know and understand learning and teaching, who know and understand the theories behind learning and teaching, who know why they do what they do, and who know why things work, and equally important, why something doesn't work. And when it hasn't worked, how can we change it? So teacher education, I think, is really important. And we'll talk about that. I think it's week 3 when we get to talk about teacher education. So this week's the big legislation, the international legislation. Week 2 is about the systems that are influenced by that international legislation. And week 3 is about the classroom. Not because the classroom's at the bottom of the heap, if you like. It's not about hierarchy, but it is about how this affects this, which is translated into practice here. So sound teacher education, sound pedagogical knowledge, I think, is important. I do wonder if, in light of my comments about learning and standardisation, if a system a good system is one that might actually not strive to standardise systems, to standardise strategies, to standardise learning and learners and teachers. Because I think when we do that, it perhaps makes it difficult to then respond in ways that are appropriate. A system, I think, needs to truly value and recognise difference and diversity, and a system that sees education as something for the greater good, not something to make money from, and maybe a system that's about learning and not just about the economy. That's not to say the economy is not important. I'm not saying that, it is. But I think learning needs to be a much more rounded thing than simply to be linked to the economy. Now, the economy and education is not mutually exclusive, excuse me, but I do think that they need to be seen perhaps in tandem. Does that all seem a bit utopian? A bit of a tall order? Excuse me. Well, does it seem as unachievable as Sustainable Development Goal 4? Well, maybe. However, I think one of the things the last 35 years has taught me, working with teachers, is that when a teacher has children and young people and learning at the core of what they do, then I think actually we might just start to get to that system that you asked about in your question. Do we have any other comments or questions?
Yeah, we've got a comment.
Oh, can you excuse me? Oh dear. Okay, this question is from Dennis. Thank you, Dennis. It said it's also quite common for children and families that depend on small-scale fisheries and farming to have to leave school temporarily to help the family with labour at peak harvest seasons. Indeed, I don't know what country you're sending that question in from, but yes, you're absolutely right, that having to help with the family, with the economy, the economics of a household often results in children being out of school. Interestingly, here in Scotland, we have an October holiday week. Usually falls somewhere around about the 15th of October is usually in that week, so kind of second, third week in October, we have a school holiday week. And historically, that school holiday week is there because the children used to go out of school to go and help pick potatoes. So that's an issue that has been an issue for many, many countries, including ours here in Scotland. And again, I guess if you have children who've gone out to help with farming, fishing or whatever with the family, which is very necessary for the family's economy, then it's about what do you do when they come back. And schools need, perhaps we need to help schools to think about how they bridge that gap, that learning that has happened. I think it's also not to think that when a child's not in school, that they're not learning. To come back to the Gypsy Traveller question, I remember one of my first year undergraduate students, so they were here for 4 years to become a primary teacher. And I remember in meeting them one Friday, they'd all been out in schools. They'd come back into university and they were sharing experiences. And I remember this girl saying to me, oh, I don't know what to do. There's this boy's come back to the class. He's not been in school for 6 weeks. He was part of a family, Gypsy Traveller family. He's not been in school for 6 weeks. He hasn't learned anything. And I challenged her on that. Because actually what she meant was he hadn't learned anything that the class had been learning. But actually, I think if you asked him, found out a bit more about what he'd been doing during those 6 weeks, I suspect he'd actually learned quite a lot. So I think there's a tension between what schools want young people to learn and then what other learning they might do elsewhere. And then it's about how do we bridge that and bring that together. Michael, you've got back to me, thank you. Is this a statement or a question? Let me see. Question. Primary education for all, including here in Scotland, gives our children the best possible start in life, but it is only through GCSEs and National 4s, that's our standard exams here, through these qualifications can they progress to further education, meaningful employment and modern apprenticeships. Absolutely, and I guess that's our and not just out of Scotland, but just generally that quest for paper qualifications. It comes back to how we measure things, what we value, how we assess. Yeah, you're right. We are looking for that kind of paper qualification, and yeah, I don't have any easy answers for that one, Michael. But it is perhaps about having to think differently about how we currently support young people who are out of school for a period of time and who then come back if it be, for example, from a gypsy travelling community, in order to try and get them to that point of being able to sit our national exams. Curriculum for Excellence, that's our curriculum framework. It's not a national curriculum, it's curriculum guidance that we have here in Scotland. Curriculum for Excellence, I think, was trying to think differently about education and to talk about process rather than product. But we still have, in many ways, an assessment system at the end of that still assesses in a certain way. So there is, I think, a tension within our system here. Yeah, again, as I said, no easy answers, but perhaps the first part is to ask the questions in order that we can share and discuss and debate. So I think that's been the end of our questions coming in. I think it's also the end of the questions that people have posted. Can I thank you very much? I think we've picked up a few viewers. Thank you to those who stayed with us. Thank you to those who joined us. If you're watching later, thank you very much for tuning in. We're really looking forward to the rest of this week and to weeks 2 and 3. Please keep your comments coming, because together I think we can actually start to make learning better. Google Hangout next week is Friday, not Wednesday, next Friday. So hopefully we will all be here again and we'll see you next Friday. Don't forget to post your questions. Thank you very much. It's been great to be with you, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you. Bye-bye.